Since we have, this is awesome. We have Travis Walton just walked in, and so we have. Look at this nice full panel, and I'm going to take a little bit of a video that will be up on the website so you can see everyone here. If you don't mind, I'm going to pass this over for a minute to the mic. If you wouldn't mind passing that over to Kathleen Marden to say hi. Hi, Kathleen.
Hello.
And it was so nice to see you. I seem to run into you all the time at conferences everywhere.
We do run into each other quite often, don't we, at conferences?
Yeah. So what's going on with you? It sounded to me today when we talked briefly that your title changed a little bit for MUFON, or is it basically the same?
We decided to change the title from the abduction research team to the experiencer research team. The reason for that is that I had a lot of complaints over a number of years about the word abduction because it implied that it was a negative experience. And some people were saying, well, I don't view my experience as being negative. And other people tried to convince me to use the word contact or contactee. But to me, that implies a positive experience. Going back to the 50s, contactees. So John Mack came up with the term experiencer. It seems to be more of a generic term that applies to anyone who believes they've had this kind of experience. So we went with the word experiencer. So I hope people
it's all semantics.
Are happy, but I have already received a complaint saying, why do you want to blur the lines here? Why don't we call it abduction again? So you can't make everybody happy.
It's like the UAP and UFO, and there's is it? I'm trying to think who it is. Is it Richard Haynes that doesn't like to use the word UFO? Just like it's a bad thing, and it can be conjured as a bad thing because of the way a lot of society looks at it. So there was one other thing you and I were talking about. So you're getting contacted sort of organically. People are reaching out to you from all over. You said from Italy, Poland, places like that.
Yes.
So how does that happen? They just find you on the internet? And
oftentimes they find me on the internet. They've maybe heard me on a radio show. Or also MUFON is expanding quite a lot now around the world. Mm-hmm. And I'm MUFON's international and national as well, director of experiencer research. So they might have heard my name through MUFON as well.
Okay, now we're going to say hi to Stanton, and I'm just hoping the microphone cord reaches over there.
It seems to.
Yeah. How you doing, Stanton?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
Hey, you look pretty good. You look like you're in good health these days. How are you feeling?
I am. I mean, so I had a heart attack. Lots of people have heart attacks.
Are you tired of people asking you that?
Not really, because there have been some strange stories out there where some people were told that I had passed away.
I heard that.
And I told them rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated, as Mark Twain said. Others have had me being in poor health and so forth. And, I had a heart attack. I had 2 stents put in. I spent a few days in the hospital being bored stiff. And that was it. And I've gone about my life, and I've driven and lectured and flown and...
And you're glad to get out of where you're living right now with this snow, aren't you?
I tell you, if I had a choice of places to be, I'd much rather be here than back in Fredericton, where it was 10 below the other day and where there's 4 feet of snow on the front lawn. And I say lawn in quotes. You can't see anything green. So I'm here. I've got a talk in San Diego next week, too.
Oh, really? So are you staying here and then going over to San Diego? Or?
Yes.
All right.
Get home until a week from Thursday. So
you're a smart man, Stan.
Well, lucky. Arranged everything, of course. It just happened that way.
Perfect. So how do you think this seems like it's a great conference. How do you think it's going?
Well, I haven't had much chance to see how it's going.
Oh, that's right. You've been in the vendor room, right?
I've been in the vendor room, and people all want to talk to me, and they all want to ask me how I am. And
Yeah.
I get a lot of thank yous for all I've contributed, which just reflects how old I am and how long I've been around.
Yeah.
So I haven't really heard any of the speakers yet. There is one event, two events I have to participate in. One is that I will be in the last panel on Sunday, the last event of the conference, as an invited guest, and it's talking about whistleblowers. And I'm a little concerned. One of the people on the panel is Pocklington, I think that's his name, who did Mirage Men. I read his book and I watched the movie, and I think he's all wrong when it comes to the abduction phenomenon and all this stuff that he's saying government intelligence agencies are creating all this stuff as mythology. But he's got so many mistakes, so many factual errors, and so many things he's ignored. For example, he blames Roswell on the Aztec story, which makes no sense at all. And he hasn't done his homework. So that's one event. It'll be interesting for me. The other is...
Tear them apart.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
The other is that George Knapp is giving a talk, and then afterward he's interviewing Bob Lazar on stage.
Right.
And
we know about... I remember you and I talking about you doing the research on his schooling background.
Well, not only primarily his schooling background, yes, and I found he wasn't telling the truth. I talked to his high school, for goodness sakes. He was in the bottom third of his high school class, and you don't get into MIT with that. I talked to 5 different people at MIT, and none of them ever heard of him. And I talked to a legal counsel who said there's no way to erase his records. Once you're in the system, you're in the system. And, of course, MIT was doing classified research back in the 40s, so it's not just, it has to do with the government kind of thing. They're a pretty independent group at MIT.
Now, let me ask you something, Stan. Are you actually going to ask
well, I don't
Lazar?
know. That's why I'm going there to see what they'll let me say.
Yeah.
I have no
Take
idea.
your heart medicine first. Just to be...
Say what?
Take your heart medicine first, just in case. Yeah.
Well, look, I tried to meet with Bob back 25 years ago. I was here when in Las Vegas when George originally talked about the story. And because I'm a nuclear physicist and I was being asked about this young nuclear physicist, I figured I ought to check things out because I don't want to reflect badly on the trade, so to speak. And that's when I kept coming up negative. And so I have trouble believing what somebody says. If you can't believe what he says about himself, why should I believe anything else? There's no doubt Bob is a bright young, well, he's not so young anymore, but neither am I, guy. But is he telling the truth? That's what
it's kind of, and what I do for work is fine arts and things like that. And it's kind of like if there's a fake in the bunch, then you have to look them all over. You have to very carefully examine this person knew. If this person is selling a fake, then it kind of loses the whole credibility thing. So I understand where this is going.
I'm glad you mentioned that because it's a point I've tried to make to people to switch the subject over to MJ-12. If you're going to make a fake, a fraud, I don't know what the right term is these days, you want to do as little as possible to call attention to it. Nothing out of the way. You stick to the procedures that went with the person you're trying to emulate or whatever you're doing. And what I recently did in 2 articles for the MUFON Journal is in one list a dozen arguments that have been made against the MJ-12 documents showed that none of them stand up. They hadn't done their homework. And the other is a whole bunch of stuff that we didn't know to be true that turned out to be true well after we got the documents. How did the person know? Psychic faker, or psychic hoaxer? What is it? Just to give one example, the date of one of the important items is the only date in an 8-month period where President Truman met with James Forrestal and Vannevar Bush at the same time. And the memo is from Truman to Forrestal and naming Bush within the text. And that's the only date in an 8-month period where those 3 met together. And I asked the Truman Library whether anybody else had ever asked the question No. There are some strange, the date is not continuous on it. September and then the 1947 is at an angle to it. It obviously had been in a typewriter twice. Now, why would anybody faking a document do that? You don't want to call attention to that. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of other items like that. And I always remember what Bud Hopkins told me about artists faking, artwork of some known artist.
They always want to make it very, very similar. A lot of times they'll find a painting that's already painted that looks just like an artist's work, but of course it's not a valuable artist, and then they'll just it mysteriously gets the artist's name put on it. So it's along the same lines.
But you don't do anything to call attention.
Right. It has to be close.
True with documents too.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, here I am, a physicist, getting into artwork and stuff like that, but it's kind of fun, and there's a real challenge here. I feel that people have a responsibility, if they're going to claim to be researchers, to do their homework.
Yeah.
Just to pick one thing, I made a point about Dr. Donald Menzel being a member of this MJ-12 group. Everybody knew he was a total debunker. He'd written 3 debunking books. How could he know about a crash saucer, alien bodies, et cetera? Well, I got permission from 3 different people to see his papers at Harvard. People complain, and I found, to my total astonishment, because I didn't like the man when he was alive, that he told Jack Kennedy he had a longer continuous association with the National Security Agency and Navy intelligence of anybody in the country. Nobody knew that. And so how did they know that? But knowing other people who say he couldn't have led a double life, and I would point to some spies who have nicely led double lives, Burgess, Philby, and McLean in England and so forth. But none of them have gone to Harvard to look at the papers. Well, darn it, if you're going to say it isn't true, check it out. Don't just say, well, I know it can't be, so I'm just going to say it isn't. Travis, you've had the same problem.
Here.
Haven't you, with people making claims where they don't know what that is?
Oh, yeah. That people, just make something, they can't back it up, and, it's pretty easy to just blow them out of the water when you produce. And you can direct people to the original source for the, authentic information.
Yeah. And that's what we have to do. We in ufology have to police our sightings, if you will, by checking out the facts. I found somebody who worked for Truman the entire time he was at the White House and asked his opinion about the documents after sending them and stuff like that. Nobody else has done that.
How long ago was that?
More than 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. I've been to the presidential libraries, and I find they're very valuable, and the people are very helpful. And, well, as another example, every top secret document has to have a top secret control number, I was told by several people. Well, I'd already published a couple that didn't, that I know are genuine because they came from the archives. So I asked the archivist, we have loads of top secret documents without top secret control numbers on them. But nobody bothers to check that. They know because when they worked at a certain office at a certain time, all our documents had top secret control number. Well, to generalize that to everybody is ridiculous. Are there phony abduction experiencer stories? Of course. Does that mean everybody who claims one is lying? Of course not. So there's some rules for the game, and they don't seem to be being adhered to by people who attack.
Stan, can you think of another question to ask Travis since you have the microphone?
You looking forward to the movie?
Yeah, that will be the first time I've seen it.
Well, I haven't seen it yet.
I'm supposed to introduce it, but I haven't even seen the trailer for it yet. So I don't know whether to say, rah, 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 this is great or not. I'll know after I watch it.
That's Friday night?
Yes, Friday.
Friday night, 7 o'clock.
Yes,
somewhere.
Friday at 7.
I don't know where, but...
Well, a lot went into this production. It was quite a bit of in-depth research. A lot of people that were very hard to get a hold of were interviewed. And, I'm sure, there's a pretty wide, comprehensive amount of content there. And how it was all edited together and whether it would just be exactly the way I would do it, I'm waiting to see. But
I'm looking forward to it. because I think they're going to use a few minutes from my movie UFOs Are Real, because I interviewed him back when he was a young man. I was younger, too.
Stanton Friedman was one of the first researchers to actually visit the area and the site.
And talk to the people.
He does his homework.
Travis, in the movie Fire in the Sky, for instance, there is a ufologist that, I don't even know if any of this is accurate, but there's a ufologist that is like waiting to see you and puts a lot of pressure on you. Was that real? And if so, do you want to talk about who that was? Or?
Well, that scene doesn't depict a particular incident that actually occurred, but there was quite a bit of back and forth between the various organizations, some of which don't exist anymore. But in my mind, I associate that scene mostly with a now defunct organization called Ground Saucer Watch, that all of the people in there with a little research uncovered that they had, to put it mildly, exaggerated their credentials.
Yeah, well, that's true. And I checked on one of them who claimed a degree from a certain school, and he didn't have one. I'm fond of checking on people that strike me as not telling the truth about their academic background. That's one of the things that'll come up about Lazar. I hope I get a chance to express my...
I hope you do too. And unfortunately, I won't be here to actually see that. But I know they'll have the DVD and, they'll be recording it. But, yeah, I would... I think Bob Lazar is a very bright person,
I've said so
like you say,
times.
And everything. I mean, he's sharp. The story is a little... it'll be interesting to hear, what he has to say after all this time. And I think... the question and answer part is going to be the cream of the crop right there.
Are you sure they're going to have one?
I would think so. I mean, they're supposed to have one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Stan, can you go into a little more about when you researched Travis's case, since it was so early on? I just never heard that before.
Well, of course I'd heard the noise, and I talked to the people at APRO, which doesn't exist anymore, Coral and Jim Lorenzen, to get their findings. And I also talked to Jim Harder, Dr. James Harder from University of California, Berkeley, who did was that the only hypnosis?
Yes, that's the only hypnosis.
Yeah, and I've known Jim Harder and for quite a long time. He's gone too now, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
But, and so after talking to the people, I was working on the movie UFOs Are Real, and I wanted to use this as one of the cases. We traveled across the country. We talked to Harder in Berkeley, going up. There's a way to get up to his house in the Berkeley Hills on a sort of a tramway, which is kind of different. We talked to Betty Hill, talked to Jesse Marcel down in Louisiana, talked to several other prominent people. Marjorie Fish with the Betty Hill star map, Dr. George Mitchell, or Dr. Mitchell anyway, of the Ohio State University Astronomy Department, who had some strong things to say about the accuracy of Marjorie's work. And so we went to people who were directly involved in cases. And Travis's case was good because there were several people involved. We talked to Mike Rogers, too. And because we went out to the actual location, so you could get a feeling for what the area was like. That part of Arizona is a little bit different from New England, for example, or from Ohio, where we were, and other places like that. So I was very favorably impressed with Travis. It took us a while to get there, of course, because Snowflake is not really near any large place.
It's quite a ways out of the way.
Yes. And I was, all of us, there was only a small group of us making the movie, but we were quite impressed with Travis and with Mike and with the circumstances. And as I've tried to tell people, if you go to a small town and a guy is known, you get a reputation. Everybody in town knows you. You can't hide. They'll say, oh, he's a liar, or, he makes up stories all the time and so forth. And There's a little bit of that in Roswell, too, that you get a reputation. And we asked around in Snowflake. We visited Travis at his home, met his family. And Travis won't mind my saying this, I was impressed by the fact that he delivered his own children. Having been present at the birth of my daughter, that made a very favorable impression on me. And it takes somebody with a certain kind of devotion to doing the right thing. That's an awkward way of saying that. But who can be trusted with significant events. In the birth of a child, several of them is certainly a significant event. And I don't think I've ever said that to Travis before, but I was impressed by the fact that you had delivered your kids.
Well, thank you. And, I contrast your hands-on, in-person investigation with that of my critics. None of them had ever spoken to me, visited the site, or in any way done any sort of in-person, hands-on research.
So there are different ways of doing things.
Kathy, could you tell us, did Betty Hill ever look in or talk about Travis Walton, or did that ever come up? Do you know?
Yes, absolutely. Betty was asked to speak with Travis after this happened. Jim Harder, Dr. James Harder, was active in Betty's case and also a friend of Betty by the time I met him. And Jim was talking about his investigation of Travis's case, and I happened to be at Betty's home when this was going on. Betty had already spoken to Travis, and the concern was that Betty had had this experience herself. She was also a social worker, and we knew that Travis was quite shaken by this event. And so Betty was asked to speak with Travis in order to try to calm him down, so that he'd have the opportunity to speak with someone who understood what he was going through, who had been through the same kind of experience himself.
And the conversation was quite effective to that end. She had some good advice.
Did they stay in touch?
I have quite a lot of correspondence from her over the years that I want to go back and look at with fresh eyes.
And I have to tell you that Betty did not believe that everyone who thought they had been abducted actually had been. But she really did believe that Travis's event was real and that he was the real thing. Jim Harder talked about how traumatized Travis was by the event and told us about his hypnosis session with Travis when I was at Betty's home.
I see. That's interesting about Betty. I never knew that she had some skepticism for other abductions. That almost gives her a little more credibility herself.
Yes, and you may not know, too, that Betty was actually an investigator for the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, after her experience. Mm-hmm. And she investigated other abductions herself.
Wow. While I have you here, I was at a conference when someone took me to the side and was talking to me, and they said, "You know that Betty and Barney Hill is, a bunk, don't you?" And I said, "What do you have to say?" They said, "Well, there was a light on Cannon Mountain that went up in 1959 or something like that. And if you drive along, it looks like a craft, being up in the mountain. And then there's a jack-o'-lantern restaurant that has a jack-o'-lantern that could look like a flying saucer landed." What about all that? I mean, did she hear that in her lifetime, or was she confronted with that?
Not in her lifetime, but I have heard it and I have read it. And I've actually even investigated it. Uh-huh. Because, of course, the light that was on top of Cannon Mountain was smaller in 1961 than it is today. It's been replaced. But the new investigator who has been trying to debunk all of this claimed that he went to the Mount Cleveland picnic area. And from the Mount Cleveland picnic area, he could see that light on top of Cannon Mountain. So I went to the Mount Cleveland picnic area and looked for the light at night. Couldn't find it. Couldn't see it. But I did, as I was driving toward Franconia Notch, go to the top of a hill and was able to see it very briefly from the top of the hill. Now, you have to also remember that the Close Encounter field was 8 miles south of Cannon Mountain, and you could not see the light at the top of Cannon Mountain from 8 miles south. And that's where the craft hovered only 100 feet above the Hills car. And then the abduction site was about 8 miles south of there.
I see. What would you, I'm going to ask this of you, Travis, as well. I consider, Travis is one of the big cases. I also think the Allagash case is pretty amazing. Are there some other, abductions? I know there's a lot of people that, you're involved with the free thing.
Yes.
We can talk a little bit about that. But the ones that I guess that I'm interested in right now is the cases like Travis Walton and Betty and like that. Is there any other cases in the Allagash that you can think of that really hit like the witnesses type of thing? Real solid, or is it all very hard to put a finger on whether it?
One of my favorite cases is from Casey County, Kentucky. Case of Mona Stafford, Louise Smith, and Elaine Thomas. And this occurred in January of 1976. And it was a really good case, in my opinion. The three women knew each other. Two knew each other well, another one casually. They had just gotten together for an impromptu dinner. It was one's birthday, and they had driven about, I think it was about 30 miles to a restaurant and had dinner there, did not have any alcoholic beverages. They were all interested in art. They had a good time. They turned around, and they were driving back home that night. And on the way home, they had a close encounter with a craft that came down very low over the top of their car. There was a beam of light that went into the car that caused all of them to feel very, very warm. Suddenly, the car started moving on its own. The women tried to stop. It couldn't, at about 80 miles an hour. And then all of a sudden, it stopped, and it was being pulled back in the opposite direction, almost as if they were bumping backwards over some kind of very strange highway. And you think of the Oz factor. Well, this is just really very, very strange. And the next thing they know, they're back, and they're just outside the town that they live in. And they realize that they're missing about an hour and 45 minutes that they can't account for. They go into one of the women's homes and try to decide what to do. And so they decide that they should go tell a neighbor. And the neighbor has them sit down and sketch what they saw. They all drew similar sketches. And so this was a fairly big case at that time. They didn't want to go public with it. They ended up going public because it was leaked out to a newspaper. And then some of the major organizations went in to investigate. And Dr. Leo Sprinkle went in there and did hypnosis sessions with the women. But it was a very, very interesting case. They remembered that they were taken on board a craft and that these ETs were very interested, for example, in the way their joints moved. And it reminded me of Betty and Barney in a way, because they were very interested in Betty's and Barney's skeletal structure, and also that moved their fingers, their arms, their legs, and that sort of thing. But one of the women had a really almost horrifying experience, too, where she felt that there was a lot of pressure on her head, and that was very painful to her. All three women ended up being traumatized by the experience. It had a major impact on their lives.
Mm-hmm. Travis, I'm going to ask you a different question than that, basically. Betty reached out to you, and it was probably very helpful for you at the time for what you were going through. Have you ever had the opportunity to be able to help someone in the same type of way?
Oh, yeah, I get lots of, inquiries of that nature all the time, People that have experienced something ask me what they should do, or they think they might have experienced something, what should they do? That happens all the time. But I do my best, but I very often turn it over to people who are better qualified than I.
So you ask them, or you give them information of an organization or something like that. Yeah. Now I'm going to throw a question at you, and just Linda. In this research, thank you. This research that you have been doing, kind of focusing in New York. Any abductions in that? Any abductions come to mind?
When I first started this research, I thought, honestly, I was going to talk to a lot of people who saw lights in the sky. And the first interview I conducted was with a multi-generational abduction experience family. Blew my doors off right off the bat, and I found that more often than not, people had I will call it intense experiences, because they're not quite sure what happened. At the very least, missing time. Many cases, clear symptoms of abductions. I actually started calling the Hudson Valley Abduction Alley, because it has happened so often to so many people. Going back as far as I can tell to 1929 was the first case, and they're very unnerving. The cases, people being physically tested, they may not recall the actual testing, but they have scoop marks and the bloody noses and pieces missing and sudden phobias and all, I guess, what we would call the classic symptoms of having been taken and something happened on them. One case in particular I thought was quite remarkable I spoke about today was a little girl playing in her sandbox, and she said suddenly everything just seemed to freeze. Time just stood still. She could see her mother in the kitchen window not moving, absolutely motionless. A moment later, she's on some sort of examining table, and she's hearing whoever these beings are saying, "We can't keep her. We have to send her back. She's damaged." She couldn't understand what that meant. Next thing she knows, she's back in her sandbox. It wasn't until years later she found out, as a baby, as a young child, she had some sort of defect that she had to have surgery and a drain put in her brain, which was still there. And so perhaps in that regard, she was damaged and not fit for whatever purpose they had for her.
Wow, that's amazing. Kathy, a question. I believe it may have been actually our single-person audience out there, George. It may have been you I was speaking to today about the French. Was it you I was talking about the French? Oh, I'm sorry. We're talking about abductions in not so much heard of in places like France, or say I spoke with Klaus Svan of Sweden, and he's saying, one or two abduction cases, that's all he has come across his desk every year or so. And a person I was speaking to today said the reason that people come forward about abductions here is because it's talked about. Jacobs has talked about it. He's been on TV, and people actually come forward. What's your opinion? Do you think that these things are happening worldwide? It's just that it's not so publicly known, so people are afraid to come forward or don't understand what's happening, or what's your opinion on that?
My opinion is that in the United States, if you have this kind of experience, there are a lot of groups that you can come forward and you can speak to, and oftentimes you'll have a non-judgmental listener who will listen to you. If you want an investigation, you can get that too. They simply don't have that kind of thing on a wide scale in Europe. I have people from Europe who contact me and tell me about their experiences. And so they're going to people in the United States. That may be changing because the Mutual UFO Network is expanding, and there are chapters in many countries around the world now. They're still very small, and they've just formed, and they're in the process of growing. But in Australia, for example, MUFON now has an abduction research team, and that is connected to the one in the United States as well. As it expands, there will be more opportunity for people to report these sorts of things as well. But for the most part, they're there. They're making the reports, but they're making them to us, and not on as wide a scale as we're receiving them from people in the United States.
I see. Stan, you talk a lot about, the flying saucers and UFOs and stuff like that. You don't hear you talking a whole lot about abductions. I mean, a little bit you do. And the thought just came to me, in your field or whatever, have you been ridiculed yourself from when people say, oh, you're a scientist and you're talking about UFOs? So do they give you trouble about that? And what about abductions?
Well, okay, about abductions, as you know, I'm listed as a co-author with Kathy on the book Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. Now, she did 85% of the work, so I'm listed is the way I put it. I wrote the chapter, I was the first to publish, about the star map work, Marjorie Fish's work, which I think is very important work. And I was just reading, one of the people who's going to be presenting here said Marjorie built a model of the local neighborhood. She built more than 20 models of the local neighborhood with stars, getting rid of stars, as people were saying that kind of star won't have planets and so forth and so on. Not based on her whimsy, on what the scientific community was saying. And so I think she did a splendid job, and I was glad that APRO, which we've mentioned before, contacted me to see if I would help Marjorie, who wanted to talk to a scientist. And the head of APRO knew she could trust me, Cora Lorenzen, and I met with Marjorie and went with her to Chicago. I talked to Dr. J. Allen Hynek there and so forth, and she's in the movie. So I'm interested in abductions, and if I can provide something useful, I will try to do it. I don't consider myself basically an abduction researcher. I'll tell you, I took a course in hypnosis, hoping to help my son with his hemophilia, control bleeding, and because it's been used for that purpose, hypnosis has. But during one of the sessions, the instructor took a woman back, regressed her. She was maybe 30 to 20, 15, 10, down to her 8th birthday, thinking that would be a safe time to talk about. And her voice was changing as she went back, and these age changes, And as soon as it was her 8th birthday, she burst into tears. A strong emotional reaction. Turned out her father had died on her 8th birthday. And I was so glad that professor was there, a teacher of the class, to calm her down, keep things under control, because I recognize this is something you better have somebody who's very sharp involved with. And the beauty of the Hill story is Dr. Benjamin Simon, Now, he didn't know anything about flying saucers, but he knew a great deal about post-traumatic stress disorder. And he ran a hospital for 3,000, a military hospital, after World War II. 3,000 beds for people who came back with what today, it was shell shock back then, but what we today would call PTSD. And so I was very impressed with Dr. Simon saying, in writing, that the emotional intensity as they relived their experience was every bit as powerful as that of the veterans that he had worked with. You know, your buddy's head gets blown off next to you. That's a little hard to reintegrate, that kind of thing. And so it was very important in that case. That's the strongest part of the Hill case, is that the sessions were all conducted by Dr. Benjamin Simon. And, you know, some of the myths that's going around is like there was one session and he hypnotized Betty and Barney together. I've heard that. That's nonsense. They were each done separately. They were each, amnesia was induced after each session. Strong, careful control by a scientist who really knew what he was doing. The Army made a movie, Let There Be Light, starring Dr. Simon, showing how he helped the war veterans get back into society, so to speak. And that's the most powerful thing about that case to me, anyway. I mean, I'd met Betty and Barney. Fortunately, I met Barney before he died. I don't know how to meet after death. Some people do. But I was very impressed by them. So I did go to that extent. And as a matter of fact, it was kind of strange. I was living in Pittsburgh, and I've been on KDKA, which is a big 50,000-watt clear channel station, television and radio and stuff. That's how I got my start going public on UFOs. I did some shows several times. They called to tell me that Betty and Barney were coming to town to do a television show, and they let me know where they were staying. Now, that's very unusual. Stations normally don't give out that kind of information. So I was fortunate. I had dinner with them, just the three of us. And so I had a chance to meet them, talk to them, listen, see how I would judge that. And I was very favorably impressed. And I was so glad for that opportunity because Barney died a few months later. Wow. So I'm not an abduction researcher. Do I get a hard time? Well, I know that there are people who say bad things behind my back. Somebody reported me today about somebody saying, oh, Friedman doesn't know what he was doing, or he made that up, or something like that. But let's face it, in over 700 lectures, I've only had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk.
Maybe even more. Yeah.
Well, and the audience took care of the rest of them. So that I don't worry about it. My basic rule is have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. And, you know, I've done debates, formal debates. Mm-hmm. There's a DVD of me with James McGaha from here doing a debate at a university. And I'd have anybody can look at that and see make their own choice. But I've debated on coast-to-coast radio, for example.
Yeah.
And with Seth Shostak, I got 57% of the vote. He got 33%, and 10% said, I don't know.
Let's stop on that one right here at Shostak. I just want to say something. Going back to your star map, the star map.
Yeah.
He said to me when I was talking to him one time that they actually pointed SETI toward that direction.
Well, yeah, that was one of those crazy remarks. What he said, that they had listened with the radio telescope receiver to Zeta Reticuli, and they didn't hear anything. What he didn't add was, of course, we haven't heard anything from any place that we've listened to.
That's true. Hang on just one second. Travis has to go, so we just want to say goodbye to Travis.
Okay, it's been nice to be with you all, and it's been an interesting conversation. Bye.
Don't forget the movie.
Yeah, the movie. Yes. Hey, will that? And Linda has to go too. Don't everyone leave. I can't be here alone. Is that movie going to be available to the public?
Yes, we do have copies of that for sale here at my table, and they'll also be available through On Wings Productions.
On Wings?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And Linda, thank you so much, and we're going to have you on the show pretty soon. I'll be getting in touch with you.
Yes, thank you. It's wonderful being in the rarefied air of this UFO panel.
And we're at high altitude here.
The air is very thin here, and it was a pleasure, and we'll speak again. Thank you.
Very good. Robert, we've left you out of most of the conversation. So I know that your book is on UFOs, and have you ever looked into this topic that we're on right now?
In regards to abductions? Yes, I have. In fact, it's in my book, my science fiction book, though. Yeah, not because I think it's fiction. I happen to be very lucky. I was lecturing down in Roswell in 2005, and Gloria Hawker was one of the speakers, and she was an abductee, and she needed a ride back to Albuquerque because that's where I was going back to catch my plane. So I had 2 hours with her. And I had a chance to pick her brain. At the time, I was in the middle of writing my second science fiction novel, and I wanted to find out more about these implants because my character found out that it was determined that he had an implant, and I wanted to know what they look like and things like that. So she gave me that information. She also shared with me, it might even be in her book, which is called Morning Glory, that she had polio when she was young, and she's now, I don't know if she's old as me, but getting there. People who have had polio, my sister had it too, and she was young, but people when they reach 60 or 70 start getting reoccurrence of it. And she was starting to have that problem. And her daughter, she recalls that she had to wear a brace. And her daughter was getting married the next day, and she happened to get abducted that night. Oh. And the abductee questioned her, said, "Gloria, you seem very sad today. Why? What's wrong?" And she said, "Well, my daughter's getting married tomorrow, and I have to go down the aisle with this brace." Well, the next morning she gets up. Normally she keeps the brace by the bed. She gets up and she just walks out the door and forgets all about her brace, and she doesn't need the brace anymore. Wow. And I was talking to a lady next to me at my table today. She's also an abductee, and she said she knew of several cases where people who have been abducted have been helped by that process. And maybe well, unfortunately, I don't know if you can elaborate on that. Do you know of other cases where people have been helped by abductees?
Yes, I do. In fact, yes, by ETs. Yeah, ETs. Yes. Barbara Lamb has quite a list of experiencers that she has worked with who she will talk about have been healed. And I'm aware of people who have had really pernicious forms of cancer where they have had an ET contact experience and been healed. Wow. Quite remarkable that this happens.
Yeah. Kathy, and I may call you Kathy?
Sure.
Yes? Yeah.
Yes.
I was up at the Experiencers Speak in Gorham, Maine. It was held 3 years ago or so. And I believe you talked about your own experience. Is that something you'd be willing to talk about on the show?
Yes, and actually that was last September.
Was it last September?
It was just last September that I ever.
I mean, let me just say, did you sort of hint at it before? Because, and I'm going to tell you why. Because I was up there and they said, some people came out and they said, "I think Kathleen Marden has been abducted." This was in Gorham 3 years ago.
Well, it must be something that I said
you might have hinted at
to believe that, but I have never spoken publicly about this until last September.
Okay.
And I mentioned it for the first time on a radio show a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, so I'm not breaking this for the first time.
Not for the first time.
Okay. All right.
Alejandro did.
Oh, he got me again. Okay, so can you tell us what your experience has been?
Yes, well, this has been very perplexing. And you might know this about me, but I'm a natural skeptic. Mm-hmm. And it's been very difficult for me to even convince myself that this was real, even though there were witnesses. There was another person with me at the time. I've always attempted to find some kind of rational explanation.
It wouldn't be Denise.
No, it was my mother.
Your mother, okay.
And this dates back to 1966.
Oh, wow.
And what happened is that my Aunt Betty Hill was taking part in what a scientific team called a psychophysics experiment. It was really a CE5 experiment to try to call in a craft. And they actually gave her a script. And she, at the same time, every night would attempt to send a telepathic message to the ETs who had taken her to ask them to show themselves in a certain location or to land in a certain location. And so one of those locations was my grandparents' farm. Now, I didn't know this was going on at the time. The family hadn't told me.
You had no idea this
I had no idea that Betty was doing this experiment.
Mm-hmm.
But I grew up across the street from my grandparents' farm. And in 1966, April of 66, there was a landing. And one of our neighbors, who was a commercial pilot returning home from work, saw the UFO coming down onto my grandparents' land. It woke my grandmother up, and she looked out the window and saw it coming in. She was terribly frightened at that point. She woke my grandfather up, and he also saw it, and that was about it. They heard knocks on the door.
They're polite then.
Like this.
Yeah.
Well, what Betty has said was, knock on the door and you'll be invited in. And my grandmother remembered that part of it and wanted nothing to do with it at that time. Well, in the years that I would discuss that with Betty, I would say to her, why do you think they landed? And why would they just come in and land? And they left physical trace evidence on the ground. They sheared off some trees. Trees were sort of splayed out in a circle around where this came in. The bark was curled on the trees. They were sheared. Some of them were sheared up. And so I said, you don't think they were just sitting down for a coffee break, do you? What was going on? And I was so curious because at some point, and I knew that my mother and I had the same memory of finding ourselves on a craft. I was on a table, on an examining table, undergoing this exam, which was horrifying to me. Something else I'd never put together, too, is that in that same time frame, we started to have paranormal experiences in my childhood home. Light orbs that appeared to be intelligently controlled, moving around. Also, poltergeist-type activity. And we had never had that in the home before that point. And so after years of research, I finally put all of this together in my 2012 questionnaire, my commonality study, which you can read on my website at Kathleen-Marden.com. And it's also, I talked about it in the book that Denise Stoner and I did, The Alien Abduction Files. I found out that I had all of these commonalities that Denise had.
Really?
And I had memories. I had missing time at one point when I was riding in a vehicle, and wanted just to write it off as being something else. I never wanted. I'd have to say I was in denial, but at the same time I was suffering trauma after some of these experiences where I wasn't able to fall asleep at night. I felt fearful. I had the classic symptoms, but I was always trying to explain it as something else. Mm-hmm. And finally, I came to the point where I said, no, I can't deny this any longer. My mother and I had this memory. These things did happen in my life. I talked to other family members who told me they also had these memories.
So it's really in every part of your family then. I mean, your aunt to begin with, or earlier, would you say? Probably to begin with.
Well,
it was 1960, Betty?
It was 61. 61. But my mother had a close encounter